Guys, welcome back. It is now time to write our first test. Let's start by getting rid of those tests, those example tests. And the first test that we are going to write is one that tests whether a user can add sites to their account. So we are going to test the sites controller. What I like to do is to have each test in the same path of the class they test on the app folder. So if we're going to test the sites controller, I want the test to reside within HTTP controller's sites controller test. In that case, inside the feature folder. But that's totally up to you. Some people would rather just have everything inside the feature folder, but I particularly do not like it. So we can write our test by running the command make test. And we can say HTTP controller sites controller test. If you don't pass any flag, Laravel is going to automatically put it inside the feature folder. If you pass the unit flag, Laravel is going to put it in the unit folder. Let's run it. We can see it. Let's get rid of this. Now, actually, there are two ways to write tests. You can either use test before the name of the test. You could also use an underscore here, or you can use your own test name and pass a test flag right here. That indicates PHP unit this is a test. And the syntax I like is it allows the user to do something, or it creates sites. That's how I write my tests. Let's get rid of this. The first thing we're going to do is to use this trait right here. This instructs Laravel to always refresh the database after each test. Now let's write our first test. So it creates sites. Let's set our little annotation here to indicate this is a test. Now let's think of it. What do we need to test? Well, first of all, we need to create a user. After that, we need to make a post request to a root to create a site. After that, we need to make sure the site exists within the database. And then what do we need to do? We need to make sure we see the site's name on the page. So see site's name on the page. Let's go step by step. To create a user, we are going to use a factory. And Laravel already ships with the user factory. This allows us to create fake data. So we're going to start it within the user variable, and we're going to say user. Let's import it. Factory. If you're using Laravel 7 or lower, you're going to use factory, user class, create. In this case, we have the factory method here. And we're going to say create. Let's jump inside this and just run our tests. Let's see what we get. Okay, cool. So we get a user. That makes us sure that we are refreshing the database and that the test is running. Now we need to make a post request. Let me give you guys a quick tip a little bit ahead of time. Most of the time, we're going to call this method without exception handling. All it does is disable Laravel's exception handling. Now, see what happens. When you use validation, what actually happens is that an exception is thrown and Laravel's exception handler picks up the exception and turns it into a proper response. If it's a regular request, it redirects the user and stores the errors on the session. If it's a JSON, if it's a request that expects JSON, it returns them in a JSON format. In most tests, we don't want this. Unless we're testing validation. Another use case is when you use the abort function. But in most tests, we don't want the exception handler. So we are usually going to use this right here. Reason being is if we get some sort of error, the exception handler may pick it up and return a proper HTTP response, and we don't get as descriptive messages as we could on the errors. Now let's make a post request. To do this, we are going to store the response on a variable, and we are going to say this post. Pretty simple. We know that we want to post it to the root. We don't have it already, but we can say what we expect it to be. One cool thing about tests is that you can kind of make the API in your head as you go before you actually write in code. So site store, and then we can pass the parameters. So the first parameter is that we want the name to be Google, and we want the URL to be google.com. Now, we also want to make sure that we are making this request as this user. So we need to add the acting as method. To make sure the site exists in the database, it's actually pretty simple. We just need to pick up the latest site, which is actually the first on this case. Let's import this class. and then we need to make some assertions. This is going to be the method that we are going to use the most in tests, assert equals. So we want to assert that something equals something else. So we are going to say Google, and then we're going to pass the name. Then we are going to say, I don't know how to write anymore. Okay, https google.com URL. Another cool thing that we want to make sure is that we don't know if the site is online or not yet. So let's change our migration to make this nullable. And we also want to make sure that the user, the owner of the site, is the user we created. And this is also very simple. Assert equals. We can say user ID, site user ID. We are passing a relationship right here. Okay. Another thing we want to assert is that we only have one website. And let's actually move this assertion up to the top. So assert equals 1 and the number of sites. And to make sure we can see the site's name on the page, we can do assert ctext. This is a method within the test response class, and this is actually on the response. Google, that's all we need. Okay, so we have our test figured out. Let's run it and see what we get. Root sites.store is not defined, so let's add it. Let's add a middleware. We only want authenticated users to have access to it. Let's add a resource, sites controller, the class. Let's run it. Class sites controller does not exist, so we need to add it. Remember, we are using Laravel 8. If you are using Laravel 7 or below, you are probably going to use the old notation, the string notation. So let's create this class. We actually have a site controller right here, but I particularly do not like the syntax. I prefer it to be sites controller. So let's just change this file. Let's rename it and let's run it now. Oops, we forgot to import it. Let's import it and run it. Failed asserting that 0 matches, expected 1. So line 30, we are talking about this line. That's because we're not creating any website. So let's create it. If we go here and let's jump into the request, you can see that a request is being made, sure. So let's create a site. We have access to the user, so we can say auth user sites. This is a relationship, and we can pass the name to be the request name, URL, request URL. Let's run it. Undefined method user sites. Okay, so we haven't defined this relationship yet. Let's add it. We want it to have many websites. And we also need to add the relationship on the site model. Let's run it now. So failed asserting that empty contains Google. Yes, we're not returning anything really. So let's store this within a variable. And let's redirect the user to the site page. So sites.show. If you don't know what this notation is, this is the root's name. When you use the resource method, it automatically generates a name for you. You can use the artisan route list command to see the name of your route. But if you're using it manually, like this, you need to add a name. So you could pass the name method and say sites.store. Now, this is not required. If you want on the test as well, you can just do a regular redirect. So we could do sites like this, but I prefer to use this syntax. Let's run it. So you see that Laravel is actually stopping on the redirect. That's funny because that's an error that many people stumble. symbol. And we need to tell Laravel to follow redirects. And we can do this right here. Before we make a request, we can go and say following redirects. And this is a method within the make HTTP request straight. So if we add this, Laravel should follow the redirect. Let's run it. Okay, so we're still getting an empty response because we're not doing anything here. So if we do return Google, it works, but that's not what we want. We want to return a view. So let's return our view. Sites.show, and let's pass the site. If you don't know what the syntax is, compact basically turns a variable into an array. So compact site basically returns site. That's it. That's the same thing. Let's run it. We get an error. So we don't have the view. Let's create it. Resources view, sites show. And well, we don't have a layout yet, so let's just do one of our own. So for now, we're just going to do h1 name. That's it. Let's run it. And yeah, we can see that we ran one test and we had 6 assertions. Now, just to finish things up, another assertion that we could add is to make sure that we are on the correct URL. And to do this, it's also very simple. We can do assert equals. We know that the URL we expect is route sites.show and the site. And we also know the current URL, which is URL current. So let's run this. And it passes. So this is really, really cool. Now, if we were to return a different URL, for instance, let's change this to index. Let's get rid of this. Let's see what happens. It fails because it does not have Google. So let's comment this out. And now it fails because we are on the incorrect URL. Let's get this back here and let's get rid of this. And our test passes. So this is it. This is our first test.